Good day, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Geography. Today, our content deals with sustainability. We're looking at today sustainability in terms of related strategies and urban settlements. As you will see, we have to have a better understanding of the South African landscape in order to integrate all our knowledge into this specific content. The key concepts that are supposed to be understood in sustainability are as follows. In this session, we will consider the following: the rural development programs and strategies that exist in a worldwide context. We will further go on to understand rural development programs and strategies in South Africa. Whilst this context is one of the most important contexts to understand for this particular section, what is important is a global understanding of how rural development strategies affect growth and development in developing countries. Further to this content, we will also be looking at the classification of urban settlements and dealing further with the urban hierarchy. Whilst it's quite interesting to understand that all these contents are also examinable in map work, your understanding of settlement geography, especially rural settlements, integrates your knowledge of the South African landscape and how people move from place to place, rural-urban migration, and how this impacts on the way people live. In order to understand sustainability and integrate this knowledge into rural settlement geography, we will now consider the following topics: sustainability and related strategies, rural development programs and strategies. Let's go through to a deeper understanding of what it is a rural development strategy. A rural development strategy or program seeks to alleviate rural poverty and create development in rural areas. If we look in the context of South Africa, over 13% of our landscape is dominated by urban settlements. Yes, these are chiefly secondary and tertiary activities, while 87% of our country is dominated by rural space. This context provides us with a framework to understand how settlement geography should be understood. Simply, this means most of our country is dominated by primary economic activities, for example, farming, fishing, forestry, and mining. And these activities generate most of the South African economics. Let's take a closer look now at some of these programs that integrate into rural development. Firstly, we will look at strategies to promote and increase rural development. These are some of the contexts in which you need to understand this content. HIV and AIDS education, awareness, stereotyping, and abstinence. These contexts affect the way rural strategies are implemented in our country. What you should know at this stage is that the bulk of our budgets in health are spent on HIV development programs. What the budgets try to install is an awareness strategy across the country, delivering and demystifying myths and stereotypes related to AIDS, as well as trying to promote abstinence. Primary education. Impacting on rural development strategies are the levels of employment. If most of our country is employed in the primary economic sector, the wealth generation of the country is minimal. Whereas if you look at developed countries, where most of the people are employed in the secondary and tertiary activities, wealth is generated much faster. Moving on, access to basic needs. One of the most important aspects to rural development strategies is ensuring that our populations are fed with basic needs services. These include the provision of water, the provision of housing, the provision of food, as well as security and clothing. Access to basic needs is essentially a product of rural development strategies. The economic growth in our country is directly impacted on how effective the government is able to implement these community-based development, or CBOs, community-based organizations, and communication at these occur at grassroots levels. If we look at levels of government, currently our government is located at a national, then a provincial, then a local level. Local government is essentially responsible for all the community-based activities, as well as ensuring that these rural development strategies by the government are implemented effectively. Further on, environmental sustainability. With development comes the reality that our activities, especially economic activities in the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector, impact on our environment. What we have to ensure is that a sustainable approach is adopted in order to preserve the environment as well as ensuring growth of the economic sectors. These are just some of the ideas to promote and increase our development strategies. Some of the factors that impact negatively on rural development strategies are as follows. The extreme mortality and poverty. Currently, large tracts of land are being neglected. This leads to soil erosion, which further means that these areas cannot be farmed and therefore cannot be productive. Simply, this increases the rate of poverty in our country. The high birth rates in our country and the high increase in HIV occurrence amongst most of our population. Remember, sub-Saharan South Africa, or those countries to the south, are generally regarded as the highest rates of HIV infections. Further to that is the high death rates. In South Africa, we have a low rate of growth, and therefore the high death rates contribute further to that. A low life expectancy. Simply, a low life expectancy is the concept where people are expected to live for a much shorter period. In our country, most people are expected to live to the age of 65. That is generally regarded as a low life expectancy when compared to developed countries. Infant mortality rates. Infant mortality rates is the high death rates at birth. Most of our country is ill-equipped, and therefore strategies need to be in place in order to ensure that infant mortality rates, or the death at birth, is decreased. Infectious diseases, for example, AIDS, cholera, and tuberculosis or TB. These factors contribute negatively to rural development strategies. What happens thereafter is the government is forced to spend more of the budget on these strategies in order to create awareness. What is important for you to understand is both the strategies to promote and increase rural development, as well as those factors and strategies that impact negatively on growth. Moving further on. In order to better understand rural development strategies, we have to look at key programs of the government, both in a global context and as the South African government. What is the government doing in order to alleviate or stop the impacts of rural development? We will first start with Agenda 21, which is a rural development strategy. This strategy came up in 1992. Note, it is a global plan of action to achieve sustainable development. Let's look closely at the term sustainable development. Simply, it means growth should be continuous, but taking into account the environmental impacts for future generations. Through international consensus on environment and development issues, including poverty, sustainable agriculture, desertification, and land degradation. These concepts, poverty, sustainable agriculture, desertification, and land degradation, are key concepts which we need to understand impact negatively on rural development programs. Agenda 21 is a strategy of rural development which tries to improve the levels of poverty, which tries to improve sustainable agriculture. Simply, the strategies that farming methods need to be more sustainable and take into account the environment. Desertification, the rapid loss in soil, valuable topsoil reduces. Land degradation, In our economic development strategies, we are concerned with how the land is being used and to what extent the land is being destroyed. Land being destroyed is closely connected with land degradation. This is through poor farming practices. The second rural development strategy that we will look to is the Habitat Agenda. Note, this Habitat Agenda came about in 1996. Let's look closely at the Habitat Agenda. The goals, principles, and commitments for sustainable, note the keyword sustainable in both Agenda 21 and Habitat Agenda, on human settlements, where all have adequate shelter, healthy and safe environments, basic services, and productive and freely chosen employment. We're looking at basic needs. So what we should be relating Habitat Agenda to is the provision of basic needs to most of our population. The Millennium Goals Development, or MDG. Note the date, in 2000. The MDG, or Millennium Development Goal, is to plan to support global development objectives with commitments to 8 development goals. These 8 development goals are goals that have been set aside at the UN. Various different organizations of the UN have gotten together and tried to ensure that growth in especially developing countries, which essentially is most of the countries in Africa, takes into consideration sustainability whilst trying to improve their economies. If we look closely at the 8 development goals, these are the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. Remember, poverty and hunger are closely related. Achieve universal primary education. Remember, in most developing countries, primary education serves as a luxury. We are quite fortunate in South Africa that it is compulsory attendance of all children to schools, especially primary schools education. Promote gender equality and empower women. Reduce child mortality, another term, infant mortality. Improve maternal health. Combat HIV/AIDS, reductions in malaria and other diseases, and ensure environmental sustainability. Develop global partnerships for development. Amongst other aspects of the 8 Millennium Goals, these are practiced globally. So our aim is to ensure that within South Africa, whatever development plans we come up, especially when it comes to rural development strategies, we take into account or take cognizance of the 8 global objectives or 8 development goals. We will, as we go further into discussions, look closely at these 8 development goals, especially in a South African context. Looking more specifically at a regional plan of rural development, Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. Now, Johannesburg is largely an urban center. However, the dynamics of Johannesburg are closely linked with both rural and urban functions. We find that in a city like Johannesburg, which is largely an urban area, there are pockets of rural areas that occur in and around the city. The strategies that we need to develop in order to improve lifestyles of those living in these areas. So, the strategy of the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation is to support Agenda 21 and MDGs by outlining further implementations of international agreements and including additional targets. Example, sanitation. What we have to understand is that not only does rural development strategies take care of rural areas, but also try to integrate development in both urban areas. Urban areas also have unique goals from the MDGs that need to be integrated into their development. Let's look at the next strategy, the New Partnership of Africa's Development, or what we commonly call NEPAD. Note the date, 2002. Let's look closely at NEPAD. NEPAD provides a framework for economic growth and sustainable development. Note how we are moving from each strategy in terms of sustainable development and also looking at economic growth. In Africa and a pledge to eradicate poverty and put Africa on a path of sustainable development. You should be seeing at this stage that as a country, South Africa, and as a continent, Africa, there is a dire need for us to develop our economies, to move it from a subsistence or primary economic activities towards secondary and tertiary activities. That means more productive economies. However, this cannot come at the expense of the environment. So any economic growth or any rural development strategy needs to be integrated with, correct, sustainable development, or the Millennium Goals, or those global issues that the Millennium Goals tries to achieve cannot be integrated any further. SADC, or Southern African Developing Countries, Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, or RISDP. Strategic direction, note the date again, strategic direction for programs, policies, and activities, and an agenda for social and economic policies. Note key aspects, social and economic. Moving further, Integrated Sustainable Rural Development Programs, or ISRDP. Again, note the date. Program to improve governance at local level. I want to refer you to that, and eradicate poverty through cross-sectional priority projects. Note that these projects are moving from a global scale to a continental scale, and then to a regional scale, example, South Africa, and then to a local scale, to a specific area within a province. The next one, Comprehensive Rural Development Programs, or CRDP. Note the date, 2009. National Collective Strategy to fight poverty, hunger, unemployment, and the lack of development in rural areas. And lastly, the current strategy, New Growth Part, or the NGP. Note the date. It's a national strategy, again, for accelerated job creation through planning and infrastructural development. Infrastructural development speaks specifically to the development of transportation networks as well as railways, example, the Gautrain. So let's look closely at all these projects and try and understand them in the context of South Africa. From the turn of the century, there has been an integrated and stronger move towards developing the South African economy, simply to spread the wealth of the country to all peoples that inhabit the country. However, as we develop further, it comes at a cost to the environment. Most of the economic activities ensure growth. However, what about our future generations? Therefore, a sustainable approach has to be integrated into any developing economy. What South Africa has done is try to ensure that we have different projects, both in a rural and urban context, in order to develop sustainably. We take these goals from global agendas, for example, MDG. What you should be noting is that these strategies have mostly come up at the turn of the century. The reason for this is the high rates of climate change and global warming. These impact directly on environmental situations that impact directly on economic growth. As we go further, we will look into deeper discussions of these different projects. Sustainability-related strategies. We will now look closely at, again, rural development strategies, and specifically programs implemented in South Africa. And what should be coming to mind is the most common or most worded of all rural development strategies by the government, the RDP, or the Reconstruction and Development Program. There are also a number of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, that have programs dedicated to rural development. Whilst it is important for government to ensure that there are rural development programs, within communities there is a high rate of development, and these communities come together, different peoples with different knowledge and different skills, in order to form NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. These organizations act on the will of government in order to ensure there is better service delivery, especially in rural areas. Let's clarify that point with saying a number of programs to improve the lives of rural people. This speaks specifically to the Integrated Rural Development Program launched in 2001, which we've referred to previously, and has a number of programs to reduce poverty and improve the lives of rural communities. What we should be looking at this stage is, have these programs had an impact on the growth and development of rural areas in South Africa? Our discussions will further go on to understand urban settlements. We will look specifically today at questions relating to the classification of urban settlements. Remember, classifications are done according to size, number of people or population, and functions, which we've discussed in earlier episodes. Urban settlements range in size from a large town to a megalopolis. Very important is that urban settlements have predominantly secondary, tertiary, and quaternary activities. It is good to refer at this stage to your rural settlements, which is dominated by primary activities. Let's re-emphasize the differences between rural and urban settlements. A good study method to remember is the drawing up of tabulated formats, or in a table, to understand better, especially when it comes to comparisons of this content. Firstly, we will look at urban and then rural. In terms of population size, in urban settlements, they are generally larger and bigger than a small village or town. However, in rural settlements, they are smaller than urban settlements. Example, smaller than a large town, especially when it comes to population. The key aspect here is population. So what we should be remembering is that more of the population lives in an urban settlement than a rural settlement. Economic activities. Again, we refer to an urban settlement with secondary and tertiary activities. Most of your industrial and commercial activities occur in an urban settlement. In rural settlements, mostly agriculture, but also forestry, mining, and fishing. We have unique situations in South Africa where mining was also integrated into urban communities. Looking specifically at functions in both communities, high order and low order functions occur in urban settlements, with high order dominating. Example, a specialist shop such as a jeweler that has lots of people. Multifunctional. Here's a key word to understand. Let's look closely at high order functions. Simply, high order functions are those functions that we do not need to survive every day. For example, buying a car. A car dealership would serve as a high order function because we cannot buy a car every day. However, bread would be a low order function. Most of us buy bread on a daily basis. That is a low order function. The difference would be that in an urban settlement, you generally have a high concentration of both high orders especially, and well as low order functions. However, in your rural settlements, you have more low order functions. Example, the corner cafe or general dealer, used by few people but regularly. Note the term unifunctional. Moving on, a closer comparison of patterns. Generally, in most urban centers, there is a nucleation of most dwellings or buildings. Buildings are generally packed closely together. Note, in urban settlements, you should be remembering that in urban settlements, especially your central business district or CBD, the high land values are generated through the nucleation of the settlement. However, the nucleation pattern in a rural settlements, buildings are also closely together, but they're more far apart. We have in an urban settlement a nucleation dominating. However, in rural settlements, we have both dispersed and nucleated. Let's look specifically at land use. Different land use zones, example, commercial, residential, industrial, recreational, and green belts. These are the different land use zones associated with an urban settlement. However, in a rural settlement, mostly your primary economic activities, example, farming, forestry, mining. All these are primary activities. Note the differences. What is good to understand, and especially during your studying time, is to draw these kinds of tables and do comparisons so that when questions of the nature of differentiate between rural and urban settlements, compare rural and urban settlements, you are better prepared to answer these types of questions. Moving on. We will further discuss urban hierarchies. Remember, in urban settlements, towns provide a central place. Here's a key concept which we need to understand in order to better understand urban hierarchies. A central place in which the local population can obtain services such as shops, banks, schools, libraries, theatres, police stations, government offices. Johannesburg is a central place because it's centrally located to provide all these different types of services. The city of Cape Town, Durban, going further in to areas of the Northern Cape like Springbok. They all serve as central places. In Eastern Cape, we have various different settlements around the Eastern Cape, and each has its own central place which provides these different types of services. And when these different types of services are provided, they serve as a central place. Oops. These shops and services can be hierarchically organized as depicted in the diagram below. Let's look closely at the representation of these shops and services in our hierarchy. We've previously made the distinction between a high order and a low order service. What this concept introduces is how are these packed and arranged according to the different settlements. If we look at our high order services, these are generally department stores, hospitals, cinemas, and leisure centers. Remember, we do not visit these areas often. Your department stores could be your local shopping mall. How often are you getting there? I hope not too often, especially being in matric. However, hospitals, cinemas. I do wish I could visit a cinema day after day. However, due to the high order function, remember, we cannot access these high order functions on a daily basis. Supermarkets and restaurants serve as middle order functions. They are more frequently visited, however, not as much as your lower order functions. Your lower order functions serve to inform you that these are aspects of services and goods that are needed on a daily basis. They become low order functions because we need these every day. I hope these low order functions are not required by you on a daily basis. I hope we've understood the difference between a high order and a low order function. The middle order function serves as a more go-between between high and low. We will further go on to understand the urban hierarchy in terms of the diagram below. Just to give you an introduction, the diagram below explains the hierarchical ordering of settlements according to size and complexity. The key concepts we have to remember is size and complexity. If you are asked the question, define the term urban hierarchy, the two key words in your definition must be size and complexity, because these influence the way a settlement is ordered on the urban hierarchy. The graph that we will look at today provides us with a better understanding. Note the following. On our y-axis, number of services provided. On our x-axis, population size of settlements. Always remember, as you move from the intersection point up the y-axis or across the x-axis, the numbers are increasing. specifically more functions than average, as well as population size. So if I'm interpreting this graph, when it comes to villages, the population size is there and the number of services is there. However, when compared to a town has more functions and provides more services and therefore has a higher population. And when it comes to cities, on this particular graph, you will note that the cities are by far much larger in terms of populations and therefore have to support the populations with more functions. Let's look at some detail on this graph. There is a positive correlation. Let's understand the word in terms of relationship between population size and the range of services offered by settlements. Higher order settlements, which is generally urban, offer a wider variety of services within a broader range. As the population is much higher, there is a diverse need for more services. So therefore, those services are supported by a broader range of activities than lower order settlements. In lower order settlements, remember, the types of functions is low. Guys, let's take a break. I will see you in a bit. We will further look at types of questions on urban hierarchies in terms of the central place theory. The central place theory, remember, was formulated by Walter Kristalla in 1933. This is one of the theories that has largely influenced your understanding of an urban hierarchy. It attempts to explain the size and spacing of settlements and the services they offer using ideas on the following diagram. To provide you with a brief explanation of Walter Kristalla's theory, it is important to understand that Walter Kristalla visited many cities all over the world and researched his findings based on high order as well as low order functions, and then decided these become central places. Let's look closely at his theories. Note the diagram. The Walter Kristalla central place theory. What serves as a central place? A central place has first order services. A first order service, example, a news agent. What makes it important to understand is how different central places linked together. So in his research, he found that there's various different areas that had news agents, and these served as central places. He regarded this service as a first order service. He further researched a second order service where there was news agents as well as a shoe shop, and he linked these further. Let's use a different color. So the areas in green had both first order, example news agents, and second order as well as a shoe shop. Then he further researched urban centers where there was a third order function, a news agent, a shoe shop, as well as a general hospital. And he found that general hospitals were located accordingly. Once we've understood how these different types of services were ordered, he then located them on a map and then drew up a central place diagram. Remember, if the order of the service was high, he then ranked them as a first order, second order, or third order. The more ordered the settlement became, the higher up the urban hierarchy it became. This ensured a better understanding of a central place. There are key concepts which you need to understand in order to better understand the urban hierarchy. Remember, when it comes to definitions and terminologies, what is of immense importance is your ability to ensure that you can extract keywords from each definition. Let's look closely at the definitions associated with urban hierarchies. A sphere of influence. Simply, This is the area served by the settlement. It is an area from which people travel to use the settlement or area to which bus services run and deliveries are made. The sphere of influence surrounds a central place. It is the total population found around and including in a central place. This is the sphere of influence. How far does the influence of an ordered service extend from the central place in terms of its population? The hierarchy of settlements extends from metropolitan areas through cities, towns, villages, and hamlets. The number of services offered and the sphere of influence increase up this hierarchy. Simply put, the larger the sphere of influence, the higher up the settlement is on the settlement hierarchy. Remember, your sphere of influence is closely related to the high number of populations. If there's more population, the hierarchy of the settlement is much higher. Everyday items such as newspapers, bread, and groceries are called low-order services, which we've previously referred to, or convenience goods, and will be available in the smallest village. Customers travel a short distance to obtain these goods. Simply put, you wouldn't take your car to buy bread from a shop around the corner because it's a low-order service. However, you will travel a greater distance for a high-order service. High order or comparison goods. Note the terms associated with high order and low order. For low order, we can also refer to it as convenience goods. For high order, comparison goods, such as furniture, jewelry, and motor cars, are not regular family purchases. So traders who sell them can only operate profitably in towns which have a large population of potential customers. Simply, your high order service or high order goods is serviced by a larger sphere of influence. What is also important when we're referring to comparison goods is the freedom of obtaining these goods is your ability to compare different types of high order goods. If we cannot buy a BMW, I'd rather buy a Mercedes-Benz. Being a high order good, cars before being purchased, we need to compare the differences, and these are associated with your high order goods. The minimum number of people required for a business to make a satisfactory profit is called the threshold populations. The threshold population largely refers to the number of people required in order to support a service. A larger threshold population is generally associated with a higher order service, a smaller threshold population with a lower order service. The maximum distance that customers are willing to travel to obtain a particular service is called the range of the service. How do we link these concepts? A larger threshold population supports a larger range and therefore a higher order service. A smaller threshold population supports a smaller range and therefore a smaller sphere of influence. We will also look at questions regarding the hierarchy of categories of settlements. In this, the background, in 1967, Professor R.J. Davies divided the 601 urban settlements in South Africa into 8 hierarchical categories. The Davies classification, as it's commonly referred to, is based on the functional content of urban settlements. He gave each of the settlements 8 hierarchical categories. Let's look closely at the work of Davies. After studying various different types of urban settlements in and around the country, he grouped them according to functions. These are the functions that he came up with. The lowest order service center, example, Machiesfontein, Van Rieenen, and Clarence, mostly in the Orange Free State. A local service center, Drummond and Wilderness. Minor country towns, Brederdorp and Mooiriver in KZN. Country towns, Uppington in the Northern Cape, Harrismith in the Free State, and Ermelo. Major country towns, Nelspruit, Grahamstown, Polokwane, and Paarl. Metropolitan areas, Bloemfontein, Port Elizabeth, and Pietermaritzburg. Major metropolitan areas, Cape Town And further examples, Durban, primate metropolitan areas, Johannesburg, Pretoria, which serves as a conurbation. What is important is to refer to the side of this diagram and note the population of the settlement and the number of settlements. Remember, as you move up the settlement hierarchy, the population increases. As you move up in the settlement hierarchy, the number of settlements decreases. The lowest centers are found at the bottom, the highest centers are found at the top. As you move up the hierarchy, the number of functions in these settlements increases, and therefore the population size also increases. So what you have to understand is the pyramid structure that is developed does not necessarily mean it's a decrease. However, the population is increasing, the function is increasing, but the number of settlements is decreasing. When R.J. Davies, after his research, designed this, he based it on the number of settlements associated and therefore came up with the urban hierarchy. Let's look closely at further explanations on this. The highest order central place, as we've alluded to the examples. Examples, Johannesburg, Pretoria conurbation, the major metropolitan area. We can include Durban into the major metropolitan areas. Metropolitan areas, Bloemfontein, Port Elizabeth, and Pietermaritzburg. Note as we're moving down each explanation, the size of the city is actually decreasing. However, in terms of the hierarchy, the number of settlements increases. Major country towns, example Nelspruit, Grahamstown, Polokwane, and Paarl. Country towns, Uppington, Harrismith, Ermelo. Moving further on, minor country towns, Brederdorp, Mooi River. Local service centers, example Drummond and Wilderness, and low order service centers, example Maartjiesfontein, Van Rieenen, and Clarence. What you will note is that there are more smaller settlements around Clarence than in Johannesburg. Johannesburg, Pretoria, becomes a conurbation. We will now look closely at typical examination questions that you would receive at the end of this year related to our previous discussions on rural development strategies as well as the urban hierarchy. Let's look closely at some of the questions that you will receive. Firstly, question 1. Shortly after coming to power in 1994, the new government introduced the RDP. The RDP principles are still used as guidelines today, but the basis of the government's economic strategy at present is called GEAR. Question number 1. What does RDP stand for? Simply, the RDP is the Reconstruction and Development Program. Let's get a basis for this. In 1994, after the first democratic elections, the new government was faced with challenges that the country needed to be reconstructed and developed. The then President Nelson Mandela came about, together with his government, on the RDP, which is the Reconstruction and Development Program. As time went on, a strategy called GEAR was developed, which is the growth, employment, and redistribution. In this particular section, we are specifically referring to the RDP. The RDP is responsible for most of the growth and development that we see in our country today. Moving on to question 2. Name the key principles of this program, again referring to the RDP. Let's look closely at the principles of reconstruction and development in our country. Number 1, service delivery. One of the crucial aspects of the government was to ensure that service delivery occurred throughout the country. Service delivery included the provision of basic sanitation, water, food, and clothing. The government of 1994 and beyond had to ensure that there was an improvement in service delivery in our country. And when you take into account the provision of these services, we are still improving on these structures. 2, growth and development. Whilst service delivery was important, it became also important for the government to ensure that all the people of the country both had a growth and economic path in terms of developing their lifestyles. This required a redistribution of wealth throughout the country, ensuring that all our people are gainfully employed into positions and ensuring that they become breadwinners within their families. These two are some of the key principles that you should be identifying in this question. Let's look at the next question. What does GEAR stand for? As we've previously alluded, GEAR is the growth, economic, and redistribution. I'm going to replace the word economic with employment. So you should be understanding GEAR in terms of growth, employment, and redistribution. In 1999, when we received a new president in the form of Thabo Mbeki, the failings of the RDP were then needed to be accelerated, and one of the crucial aspects of rural development and urban development became the employment of our large population. The strategy then had to ensure that there was large-scale growth in the country, as well as an increase in employment and a redistribution of wealth. This had to occur at an accelerated level, as the RDP was not fast enough in order to ensure its principles of service delivery. Looking at the next question, what are the key elements of this strategy? Again, as the abbreviation suggests, to ensure economic growth of the country and its population. Two, to provide gainful employment. Gainful employment simply refers to ensuring that the services that are delivered are paid for. So if we are employed gainfully, it simply means the merging of unskilled labor by training and development. Most of our structures today in terms of employment ensure there is a service delivery in terms of development and growth. Another key element was to ensure the provision of basic needs. Remember, as we've discussed earlier, our basic needs were water, shelter, security, as well as entertainment. Most of our population were deprived of these basic needs, and what the GEAR strategy tried to ensure is some of these key principles: to ensure economic growth of the country and its population, to provide gainful employment, as well as the provision of basic needs. Moving on to the next question. Question 2. Study the following graph, which shows the relationship between the number of shops and the size of the population. Immediately, once you see the word size of the population as well as services rendered by shops, you should be thinking about the concepts of urban hierarchy. If we look at the sketch represented, simply The y-axis is represented by population and the x-axis by the number of shops. Note, as you move from the center outwards, there is an increase on the x-axis across. As you move from the center upwards, there is an increasing in the y-axis. The letters A, C, D, and B. How many shops are there in settlement A? If we look at settlement A, there is no exact reading. However, it's almost at the center. Note that, between 0 and 500. Therefore, a possible answer could be 250 plus minus. And this is an acceptable answer in an exam situation due to the fact that there is no accurate reading. However, what is noticeable is that it's greater than 0 and it's less than 500, and A is almost at the center of 0 and 500. Let's look at the next question. What is the population of settlement B? If we look closely at settlement B in terms of the population, it is almost 15,000. My correct answer is 15,000. It is worth noting that settlement B has a higher population than settlement C, A, or D, which means it would be obviously higher up the settlement hierarchy. However, settlement A has a lower population and therefore a lower number of shops. What you will see that is noticeable is that settlements C and D have almost the same numbers of population, but in terms of shops, there is a greater number of shops at settlement D than settlement C. Maybe these kinds of questions should be asked. What is important is, as you answer each question, you should be looking for trends in the graph that you pick up from the types of questions that is being asked. Looking at our next question, explain what is meant by the term urban hierarchy using the relationship shown on the graph between the number of shops and the size of the population. Remember our key words: size as well as functions. These two words should be included in your understanding of urban hierarchy. Proper studying would ensure that you've extracted these keywords during your studying to explain this definition. However, what the question requires you to do is to use the relationship shown on the graph. The relationship is between number of shops and the population size. In order to understand this, we should be referring to number of shops and population size. A possible answer could be the relationship in terms of the urban hierarchy shows an increase in population is directly related to an increase in the number of shops. This would afford you the 6 marks that you require for this section. Remember, we have to refer to the population as well as the number of shops, as well as referring to these two terms, which refers to the size and functions of the settlement. Further explanations would suggest the relationship explains that the number of functions in brackets shops is directly related to the population size. Good. I think that's adequate explanations for this question. Let's move on now to question 3. Refer to the map below. This is called a sketch map. What you should be looking for is hints and tips from the key to better understand the types of questions that you will be receiving. What I would do is refer to the reference, which shows me that there is a cliff that is existent on this diagram, which would represent a high-lying area. There is a river that is cutting across this cliff with the possibility of a waterfall occurring, and this river leads to the ocean. Roads and streets dominated in this area here. Highland, or what we could refer to as a plateau. Marsh areas, as well as cultivated land. So what this diagram should be suggesting to you is the following. A is largely an urban center. B is largely a rural center. Let's look closely at the questions. What factors determine the site of City A? City A is located here. What factors determine the site of City A? Site refers to the exact piece of land on which a settlement is built. The city is represented by settlement A. If we have to look at the exact piece of land, it is largely dominated by the location of the sea, correct? It is as well constructed around the highland area. So we should be identifying at least 2 factors. The presence of the ocean. If you look around the high-lying area, it is dominated on the side by flat land. The presence of no contour line suggests the flat land. The gradient is gentle. That is simply saying the land is flat. And that would afford you the marks that you require for this type of question. Moving on. Why did the main development of the city occur to the west of the river and not to the east? Again, we look for hints and clues on the diagram and note the following. The river flows down the center into the ocean. The city is located to the west. To the east of the river is this area here. When we look at our key, it is having a marshed area. A simple answer is the presence of a marsh area. And remember, marsh areas do not promote development. A further answer, which is required if we look closely, is the following. If you look at the shape of the inlet, it requires the city to be developed in a certain way. The city serves as a break of bulk point. Therefore, the location of the harbor encouraged development in a westerly direction. Remember, 2 answers, the presence of the marsh as well as the harbor. encourage development in a westerly direction. Moving on to the next question. What is the main function of City A? Give reasons for your answer. City A, as it is located close to a harbor, becomes a transport town. Remember, City A would serve as a break of bulk point. Break of bulk points are generally transportation cities, where one mode of transport is replaced by another. If we look closely at our diagram, in terms of this particular sketch, the harbor serves as sea transport and then is replaced by roads and railway lines. Note the diagram suggests to you the urban area. Once this occurs, remember, this becomes a break of bulk point, which serves as a transportation city. These types of cities provide links to the interior of the country. This would possibly be a city like Durban, which serves as a break of bulk point. What is the main function of City A? It serves as a break of bulk point, as it is a transportation city when one mode of transport is replaced by another. As goods are imported and exported into and out of the country, these cities develop to provide services needed to support its function. Let's look at the next question. What is the main function of City B? Give a reason for your answer. Note City B is located in a central area and it is surrounded by cultivated areas. These cultivated areas would then serve to provide that B becomes a central place. So therefore, what is the main functions of City B? It is a central place city. Why? Possible to support the agricultural functions of the surrounding areas. Moving on to the next question. Differentiate between urban growth and urban expansion. And this question is frequently asked in your matric exam, where you must be able to understand the terminology as well as the concept and be able to differentiate or compare. In this particular question, differentiate or tell the difference between urban growth and urban expansion. Urban growth a distinction is made between urban growth and urbanization. Urban growth refers to the natural increase in the population. Remember, there are people living in the urban area already, as well as people coming from the rural area to settle in the urban area. However, when we speak to the concept of urban growth, we should remember it refers to the natural increase of the population in the urban area. Simply put, the existing population is growing within the urban area. Looking at the next point, urban expansion. Urban expansion refers to the physical growth of the city. Remember, your city or CBD expands both vertically as well as horizontally. Urban expansion refers to the areal growth. The center of your city, especially in large cities like Johannesburg, are dominated by taller buildings. When we're referring to the taller buildings, we're referring to the physical growth of the city. Hence, physical growth becomes my keyword for urban expansion. For urban growth, it refers to the natural increase. That becomes my keyword. Moving on to the next question. We will now move to question 4. And let's look at the diagram before attempting questions to understand what the concepts are related to. Number of central functions as well as population. Note that the examiners have opted to give you hints and clues with regards to the types of settlements that are located. Example, villages and hamlets, towns, cities, larger cities, example, metropolitan areas. Note again, you have an increase on your x-axis moving across, you have an increase on your y-axis moving up. Both would suggest to you that as the population increases, so too do the central functions of that settlement. Let's look at the questions. What is the relationship between the two factors shown in the graph? The relationship is generally displayed by the line drawn in the center of the graph. Whenever you are asked this type of question of a graph, remember the following. A relationship is suggesting to you you need to analyze the trend of the graph. The one set of information is based on number of central functions. In terms of the different types of settlements displayed, the number of central functions is increasing. If we look at the other set of information in terms of the population as you move through the various different settlements is increasing. So our relationship becomes the relationship shows an increase in population is directly related to an increase in the number of central functions. And your central functions, remember, becomes your higher order services. Moving on. Again, question 4, back to the graph. Name the two largest types of cities. Large cities. Our largest types of cities are, the largest of all urban settlements is your megalopolis. And that is followed by your conurbation. Remember, the largest is the megalopolis. Below that is your conurbation. These two types of settlements would represent your largest urban cities. In this particular diagram, remember, fewer large cities are represented and as you move down the graph, you'll note that there are more settlement sizes in villages and hamlets. Moving on to the next question. Explain the term range by comparing numbers 3 and 5. Let's look closely at this question. Remember, the examiner is taking it for granted that you understand the concept of range. And if you remember from previous discussions, we have used range in terms of the key concept, the maximum distance a person is able to travel in order to obtain a good or service. In this example, the comparison becomes 3 and 5. Let's look at settlements 3 and 5. Settlement 3 is located at this position. Settlement 5 is located at that position. The question alludes to Explain the term range by comparing 3 and 5. Which settlement would have a larger range? Range is the maximum distance a person is prepared to travel in order to obtain a good or service. In our diagram, it stands to reason that as settlement 5, when compared to settlement 3, has a higher number of functions and therefore a higher population, it would have a larger range, whereas settlement 3 has a lower number of central functions and therefore a lower population. The range of settlement 5 is larger than the range of settlement 3. Therefore, to complete our answer, settlement 5 has a larger range as it has, and remember, central functions, more central functions than settlement 3. Range, our keywords, maximum distance. And that further explains the answer. Settlement 5 has a larger range as it has more central functions than settlement 3. Moving on to the next question. What is a settlement sphere of influence? Our keyword for sphere of influence, correct, population size. Let's look at the diagram. If we note the following, the large city is represented right at the top with the largest number of functions as well as the highest population. However, the number of central functions in rural settlements and its populations are much lower. Sphere of influence, the total population required to support the provision of goods and services. For example, if we look at a population sphere of influence for the purchasing of a motor vehicle, a dealership or a car dealership would have a larger sphere of influence than your local shop around the corner, which has a smaller sphere of influence. Generally, your sphere of influence in rural settlements are much smaller than your settlements, urban settlements, example, towns and cities and larger cities. These urban settlements occupy larger sphere of influences and therefore have higher populations, whereas your sphere of influence in rural settlements, example, villages and hamlets, are much smaller due to the smaller populations. Moving on to the next question. The distribution of urban settlements is often determined by the function of the town. List 3 main settlement functions and their respective patterns. Let's look at this question. The distribution of urban settlements. Our urban settlements are towns, cities, and large cities. And they are distributed according to this graph in terms of population and central functions. List 3 main settlement functions and their respective patterns. In terms of this, we would look at our town, our city, and our large city is often determined by functions of the town. List 3 main settlement functions and their respective patterns. In terms of the town, you would have lower order, medium order, as well as higher order. Generally, the pattern displayed on your towns tends to be more dispersed. The pattern displayed by the town is also nucleated if we look at groupings around the dispersion. So your pattern here would be nucleation and dispersion. If we look at cities, they tend to be more dispersed than nucleated. So cities occur at a distance from each other. If we look at our major cities in South Africa, you have the location of Johannesburg when compared to Durban and Cape Town. Your major cities are quite fragmented across the country. Therefore, they are more dispersed. So in cities like the ones we've just discussed, you would have more medium and higher order, and their level of patterns would be more dispersed. If we look at our largest cities, generally these are highest or higher order, with the resultant pattern being dispersed. Again, note the cities and the way they represented. Note the nucleation of the rural. As you move up, there is a higher level of dispersion. Moving on to the next question. 4.6. What is the opposite of urbanization? Remember, urbanization refers to the percentage of the population moving towards the urban area and how the urban area increases. The opposite of that would be people moving out of the urban area to settle in and around commuter suburbs. The concept we're dealing with here is called counter-urbanization. Counter simply means the reversal. Whereas you have urbanization, where people are moving into the urban area, counter-urbanization refers to that which the people are moving out of the urban area. The concept that we deal with is called counter-urbanization. And remember, guys, these explanations are in bulleted form and therefore require you to look at the question closely. Remember, these keywords should be referring you to the types of explanations that you need to give in your answers. Although we've explained it in bulleted form, you should remember when it comes to explanations, discussions, and descriptions, you need to give answers in more fuller contexts. What we've provided you with is a bulleted format of the types of answers you should be including. And with that note, we come to the end of this session. I hope you've enjoyed and have a broader understanding of the context in which these sections need to be answered, as well as understood. Again, there is no substitute for good understanding and keywords and extractions of these keywords. What is important is that you need to make sure that your study methods supplement your understanding. The simple drawing of tables, graphs, putting points in bulleted form ensure that you have a capacity to remember. I always encourage my learners to draw web diagrams or flow charts or mind maps to integrate all that knowledge together. Remember, with settlement geography, your understanding of the South African landscape and the strategies that are ensuring growth and development are important. There should be no substitute for you constantly engaging with new material that helps to support your studying. Remember, strategies like the New Growth Path, as well as strategies of previous administrations, like the rural development strategies of the RDP, as well as GEAR, should be equipping you to better understand the way South Africa is moving. Remember to always integrate the notions of sustainable development in your studying. This would help you understand better how global warming is impacting on development strategies and how different strategies are needed to ensure that we develop for future generations and ensure that our Earth and our environment are sustained along this path. Guys, good luck for your exams, and I hope you will continue to study and enjoy the series. Thank you.